Hello, and welcome to Pithy Polemics. We're a group of friends who regularly discuss topics centered on philosophy, theology, history, fantasy, and more. My name is Nick Harrington. I'm a graduate student researcher in bioengineering at UC San Diego, and my main philosophical interests center on ideas like meaning, beauty, morality, and I've mostly been influenced by thinkers like C.S. Lewis or his predecessor, George MacDonald. In these videos, I want to summarize books that I've read to provide a convenient way for people to learn about these ideas and these authors. The book I've chosen for today is called The 3D Gospel, written by Jayson Georges. And each aspect of that title, I think, gives a good description of the main ideas he wants to tackle in his book. So the first term, 3D, that's in there because the main concept about this book is understanding that the way in which you tend to see the world is not necessarily the way everybody else sees the world, especially when we look at people in different cultures. So a large emphasis is placed upon understanding our perspective in light of the different ways in which other people view similar topics. So he wants us to see the whole complete 3D image. The term gospel is there because this author is writing from within the Christian tradition. He actually worked as a missionary for a number of years in Central Asia. So his really main heart and his focus is to look at the Christian faith and the Christian story through this 3D lens. He's concerned that especially people in the West, they view the Christian story really only in one main way. And he says that way is it's a true aspect of the whole story, but it's not the entire story. It's not the entirety of it. So he wants kind of the 3D image of the Christian faith and of the Christian story. But with that being said, I think the main idea that he is focusing on is generalizable enough that no matter where someone is on the spectrum of faith, this book still has something to offer because it still is exploring how people across the world understand ideas. And although this author applies it to the Christian story, it's still, I think, a way of thinking that is beneficial regardless of how one wants to apply it. So with that said, what I want to do is jump into kind of summarizing the main idea of the book and giving a picture of what that's like, and then going through each of the 5 chapters that the author has. Overall, this is a very short book. Honestly, it's almost more of a pamphlet than a book, which I think was the author's intention. It's not supposed to be a very research-heavy and rigorous work. It's supposed to be, I think, simple, clear, and communicate the idea that he's trying to get across. And I think he does that effectively. So the main idea about the whole book, kind of the main focus of it that he keeps repeating again and again, is that he sees that the world could be split up, that all different cultures and societies could kind of be put in 3 different categories. Each category deals with a different dichotomy. So the first dichotomy is guilt and innocence. The second is shame and honor. And the final one is fear and power. And he feels that all different cultures, they all have mixtures of all of them, but that some cultures gravitate towards one of these dichotomies more than another, meaning that the people within that culture, they're plagued by fear, or they're plagued by trying to avoid guilt and desiring innocence, or maybe they're plagued by fear and they desire power. These are the kinds of questions that they're operating under. And that's the main idea that drives the rest of his book. So with that said, we can go on to the first chapter titled Seeing New Realities. So here the author opens up with an anecdote and then outlines those 3 dichotomies that I mentioned just a moment ago. He then talks about a particular book of the Bible in which the author feels that all 3 of these dichotomies are actually present, that the Apostle Paul, as he's writing a letter to the church in Ephesus, that he actually interacts with all of these ideas. So Jayson Georges picks up on ideas like forgiveness of sin, or being welcomed into God's family, or the power that rose Jesus from the dead, and sees all of those as being kind of commenting on either guilt and innocence, shame and honor, or fear and power. But then he concludes the chapter with, I think, is one of the more interesting parts of the book, where he talks about how Western theology in particular is really influenced by individuals like St. Augustine and Martin Luther. And he says that those particular individuals really struggled with a sense of internal guilt, and so their theology deals in that realm very heavily. It's very guilt-innocence based. And so Western culture, as a result, at least theologically speaking, is really influenced by those thoughts. It's very guilt and innocence based in its perspective. And Jayson Georges has no problem with that. He thinks that that is a true part of the Christian story. But he wants us to acknowledge that that's not all the Bible talks about. That that's kind of what our culture discusses. That's what's on the minds of many people in the West. But not all that the Bible necessarily discusses. And so it's important to understand the different perspectives and kind of see the whole 3D picture. And then moving on to chapter 2, titled Culture. The author first talks about this idea of maintaining balance, and this I thought was really interesting, where he discusses the idea that while of course there's these dichotomies that he thinks are present in all these different cultures, no one culture, and certainly no one individual, is only dominated by one of these three ideas. All of them are present in every person and in every culture, but he thinks that it's helpful to at least have these categories in mind, so we can see that some areas tend to be more guilt and innocence in their thinking, especially the West, whereas other areas of the world and other individuals are more shame-honor focused, while others are more fear-power focused. But it's a continuum. No one exists in really the extremes, but it's helpful to understand these ideas and see how they play into different modes of thinking across the world and across even within an individual country. He then goes more in depth into each of these different dichotomies. So starting off with guilt and innocence, he says that these individuals, they view right and wrong in context of laws. They're very legalistic in their thinking. They view that guilt is focused on action, and that if you're guilty of something, there's an offsetting action to repay your crime. That often this mode of thinking is associated with individualism. He says, quote, "The guilt-innocence orientation frames not only a culture's morality, but also influences concepts of human identity," end quote. He says that because of that, the value of an individual is from what they do. Then in contrast to that, he talks about the shame and honor communities, in which case he says they view right and wrong in context of relationships rather than laws. So a ostracization in a relationship results in shame, which to fix that requires restoration of honor. That these communities are associated with more collectivistic type modes of thinking, and that a large emphasis is placed upon one's proper role in society, and that honor comes from fulfilling that role. So in this idea, value is based in who you are, not necessarily as much in what you do, but who you are and who you're connected with. Then he moves on to his final category, fear and power. Now this one's really interesting because they have such sharply different metaphysics from the previous two culture types that we already discussed, that these individuals view the world as saturated with spiritual forces. He identifies the fear and power dichotomy as being mostly present in tribal communities, and that these individuals fear angering spirits, and they desire power and security. He says that in these communities, regardless of whatever formal religion they might have, he thinks that behind that is animism, which he says is the idea that, quote, "spirits that inhabit the physical world can be manipulated through magical rituals for personal benefit." So he says that common practices in these cultures are things like voodoo, curses, charms, witchcraft, etc. And he doesn't comment on if these things are real. He's not trying to assess the veracity of their metaphysical view and the way in which they see spirits as being ever present. He more is just helping people understand this is the mode of thinking that these individuals are in. This is the questions they're asking. They feel afraid and they want spiritual power. And so if you go and you discuss guilt and innocence topics or shame and honor topics, it's not necessarily what they're primarily focused on. And that's the reason why he wants to bring these to the forefront, so that people can be aware of the interaction of these different ideas. He then talks about another section that was really interesting, where he discusses the reason for these different cultural types, which in his opinion is socioeconomic. He thinks that whatever systems in a society provide the resources necessary for flourishing, that system influences how the society rewards or punishes individuals, which in turn influences if individuals are thinking about guilt and innocence versus fear and power. So he thinks that there are formal institutions, there are human communities, and there are spiritual forces, and these are kind of the focuses of each of these societies, that based upon the socioeconomics of a particular area, if formal institutions are the main provider of resources, those individuals will be more guilt and innocence based. That if human communities and those who you know are the main provider of the things that you need, whether it be protection or whatever else, that shame and honor, that a right relationship with those communities will dominate. Whereas if you think spiritual forces are the source of your different resources, then fear and power will be more the dominating idea. And this I thought was interesting. I don't necessarily think that there's enough depth and enough research here to justify his claim that it is socioeconomic, but at least it's an interesting theory to try and understand why do these differences exist throughout the world. And then he ends the chapter with some different comparison tables that I found pretty helpful, just talking about here's the different things that these cultures are thinking about. So one, for instance, would be when it comes to holy writings of the religions present in these cultures. If you're in guilt and innocence, you view holy writings as providing guidance and instruction. Whereas if you're more of a shame and honor type culture, you view holy writings as providing heritage and identity. And whereas if you're in a fear and power type culture, you view holy writings as providing protection and blessing. So I'm sure anyone of various different religions will believe that their holy writings provide all three of those, that they guide, that they give identity, and that they give protection. but each culture is going to emphasize one of those more than the other. Then he moves on his next chapter, theology, and he says that, quote, the guilt, shame, fear trichotomy additionally serves as a framework for interpreting scripture and contextualizing theology. So this is where it gets a lot more Christian focus, where what he wants to do in this chapter is he takes the Christian story and he analyzes it through the lens of each of these three different dichotomies. And so I'll try to summarize as well as I can, kind of putting my own understanding of the Christian story in this, but I think largely it's influenced by the way the author decided to describe the Christian story with respect to these three different cultures. So starting off with the guilt and innocence narrative, that begins by saying God is holy and that humanity has violated God's law. And then continues to say that Jesus, what he did is he died to remove humanity's sins, offer us forgiveness for sins. And that in this system, that you don't earn your forgiveness. You don't do a lot of good deeds to be forgiven. Forgiveness is offered freely. So there's guilt that humanity has for violating God's law, and that Jesus offers forgiveness, and those who accept it are forgiven, and those who do not remain in guilt. Then if we look at it from a shame and honor perspective, the idea would be that the story starts with God as our heavenly Father, and that humanity was disloyal to God and brought shame upon itself. And that what Jesus did is he became a man to restore the honor of men. Now, I think this perspective is actually very interesting because it helps answer a difficult question. It helps answer, why did Jesus need to become human? Because I think in the guilt and innocence context, it's not immediately obvious why that aspect of it was necessary. But in the shame and honor narrative, it is a lot more clear that humanity is the one that fell. Humanity needs to fix its problem. But since no human was up to that task, God himself became a human to restore humanity's honor. So that the state of things now is that those who align themselves with Jesus are welcomed into the family of God and their honor is restored, and those who do not, their shame remains. Now, one caveat to that narrative is that some of that is how I personally think the shame-honor dichotomy best maps onto or best expresses the Christian story. When the author described it, it seemed like he was saying that when humanity was disloyal to God, that they didn't only bring shame upon themselves, but also brought shame to God. That way of pitching, I didn't really understand how that fits with the story of Jesus and how what Jesus did restores God's honor. So that's kind of a question mark in my mind of why the author chose to express it in that particular way. But putting that aside, I think it's still clear that viewing things through a shame-honor lens is still a different, but equally true from a Christian perspective, account of what Jesus did. He then moves on and looks at the final dichotomy, that of fear and power. And in this narrative, it begins by saying God is the all-powerful creator, and that humanity rebelled against God and is now under the control of God's enemy, the devil. So it really emphasizes this spiritual battle that's going on and says humanity has chosen the wrong side. So then the point of Jesus is that what Jesus came to do is he came to defeat the power of sin and death and free us from the control of God's enemy. That quite truly, those who believe in Jesus, they die with him, they die to the power of Satan, and then they're resurrected into spiritual power. So again, in this system, it's not about magic rituals or charms to get spiritual power. It's about choosing to follow Jesus. So in all three of these, I think every Christian would agree, those are all true accounts of the story. And the author really wants to help drive home the point that all of those are true, but often people from the West really only focus on the first one, but the other two are necessary both for good theology and for good expression and explanation of the Christian message. And later in the chapter, he goes through a little more specifically the Garden of Eden, as well as specifically Jesus' death on the cross to again talk about it in light of those three ideas. Then he moves on to his fourth and really final chapter that has substantial content to it and talks about ministry. And in this, he brings up an interesting idea where he says that, quote, making disciples among shame-based and fear-based cultures involves more than just repacking evangelistic presentations. The channels through which we proclaim the gospel must be adapted to the cultural context. So here I think this is a really interesting contribution that he's making, is that he's saying it's not just about understanding the Christian story through each of these different perspectives, but the actual manner in which one might want to explain this story to individuals depends upon the context. So I think the idea of this chapter is that if someone is in the guilt and innocence culture, often a pretty standard way of explaining an idea to them would be to give a presentation, maybe a speech or a sermon that tries to outline, here's my belief, here's the rational reasons why this belief is true, and you should believe it too. And that's very common in Western culture. But what he's getting at is that in other communities, that's not necessarily the way they operate. That it might be much more effective or much more in line with the way they do life to be part of the community, to make friends, to invite them over for meals, and to share and be part of them and have relationships. And that's the mode at which the gospel can best be explained. So this, I think, is an interesting and important contribution of his that's, once again, it's not just about understanding the content of the story, but the way in which someone might want to share the story of Christianity actually differs a lot from culture to culture. And then when it comes to the fear and power communities, it's a completely different game once again, is that in those communities, what the author suggests is what actually would be necessary to best present this Christian story would be a demonstration of actual spiritual power, praying for healing or praying for Jesus to meet somebody in a dream. And of course, that brings up a whole other conversation of, do those things still happen? But the author's not trying to interact with that. He's more trying to outline, this is what it would look like, that if the events in the Bible are true, if this Christian story is true, then there's actual spiritual power here, and praying for that, and praying for healing, and praying for things to occur, and seeing them occur is going to be a necessary way to convince and to show this story to individuals in a fear and power context. Whereas someone in a shame and honor or guilt and innocence context, that's not going to be as necessary, because that's not the kinds of questions they're necessarily asking. So then the final chapter he has, chapter 5, is just a summary, kind of going over a lot of the main points, wrapping up all that he's been talking about so far. And he says something interesting. He says that before we can proclaim a 3D gospel, we have to experience it in our own life. And so here he brings it to a little bit more personal application, where I think what he's getting at is this idea that what he's talking about in this book and what he's trying to do is he's not just saying, here's a way to spin this story based on who you're talking to. He continually is trying to say, here is the fullness of this story that we often miss, that it's this whole package, and a lot of times people in the West only focus on one part of it, but these other parts are necessary too. Actually, back in the theology chapter, I don't think I mentioned this before, but he has a long list of different verses that he sees are shame and honor based ways of understanding scriptures, or are fear and power based ways to really try and make this clear that this is what's really true. We need to focus on all of it. And so I think in this summary chapter, he also goes on to suggest that until you really have that image, until you really have that full view and experience all aspects of it in your life, you're not going to be able to correctly communicate those to individuals who might care about one of those aspects more than your culture predisposes you to do. So I think my final comments on this book are that I think the author does a good job of what he set out to do. This is not a large book. This is not, in my opinion, particularly research heavy or rigorous, but I don't think that was the author's intent. I don't think this is supposed to be a research paper. I think this is the author having a very simple, clear, but important idea and communicating it effectively. So once again, I think regardless of where someone is on the spectrum of faith, interacting with these ideas and just seeing, even just as an example, that if nothing else, the Christian faith is a historically relevant philosophical system. So seeing how that looks through different eyes, I think is helpful for understanding different people and different cultures. And especially for those who are in the Christian tradition, I think it is a very important concept to be aware of, that there's a lot more to our faith than sometimes we necessarily focus on, and having all these ideas and being able to hold them all together, I think gives a much fuller picture of the Christian story. So that's the 3D Gospel by Jayson Georges. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit like and please be sure to subscribe, as we'll have plenty of more content coming your way. If you learned something from this video or have any feedback at all, please let us know. Please drop in the comment section below. We'd be happy to interact with you on that. And thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.